everyone. I hope you've all having a wonderful DrupalCon Europe so far, all suitably rested and ready for another full day of content. I'm Rachel Lawson and I'm the Community Liaison at the Drupal Association. I'm lucky to have a job that means that I get to work with the best open source community in the world. I think so anyway. I also get to manage one of the things that makes our community so great, the DrupalCon Code of Conduct. I'm sure you all remember that applies at virtual DrupalCon just as much as it will when we meet again in person. Earlier this year, I attended a conference that had a profound effect upon me, the Open Source Community Africa's Festival in Lagos. I have long wanted to find ways to amplify the rapidly growing open source movement there, and I am absolutely delighted that we have attracted participants of that conference to be taking leadership roles here with us this week, like Zara, who has been working on our track team, and Ada, who was speaking at the Women in Drupal session, all about She Code Africa. I'm equally thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, also one of the speakers at the Open Source Festival in Africa, where they actually live not all that far from me here in the UK, Eriol Fox. Eriol has an incredible story to tell, with a particular focus on open source design and human rights. You're in for a treat. I think what we need, though, is a moderator with proven design knowledge to pose the relevant questions and encourage all of you to be asking questions and responding to the polls that will appear. So I'm also excited to invite Christina to be our moderator for this session. Eriol, Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm also really excited for this keynote, both for having Eriol and also for hearing about the really important topic, but also because this one is going to be a keynote where attendees will have some work to do. You will have some exercises on your right. You will find some documents for the exercises that you'll hear during the keynote. You will also have live polls during the keynote. Please answer them because we'll try to review them after the presentation, and also we'll have live Q&A and where we'll be able to hear your questions. So please answer as many questions as you can. So I leave you with Eriol. Enjoy it.
And thank you for having me speak today about centering human rights in open source design. So you can access these slides and all of the links that are within the slides and the resources from the link that is on your screen at the moment. It's to a notice page where I keep all of my talk content. The URL is https://bit.ly/ef-hrcd-drupal-2020. I'll take some time to cover content warnings first. I ask that if you have personal and traumatic experiences of these topics, that you really consider what you might need to help keep yourself safe as you listen, and to make precautions that you might need during this intro section of the talk. These topics can be really difficult to listen to, even without intimate experience of them, and they can affect us all in different ways. I primarily am interested in your safety, comfort, and well-being as we talk about difficult topics and our relationship to them as technologists. So this talk contains the following subjects: violence against partners and domestic violence, mental health, suicide, terrorism, guns, political violence, natural disasters, missing people, PTSD, and COVID-19. The talk also touches on topics around the power dynamics between citizens of countries formerly colonized, racism, education, and social status prejudice. There may also be mentions of other topics that some may find distressing. As I said before, please take care of yourself as you listen, take breaks, and if you need to, switch off your audio to take that time for yourself. Some of these slides also have no photos, please, at the top of them. Please do not share, make copies of, or take photos of these slides and share them socially. This is to protect the content or the people mentioned or shown in these images. So to dive into our structure this morning, we'll be looking at the term human rights-centered design and its relationship to open source. We'll have 3 stories about human rights and technology, 2 of which are related to open source software. We'll talk about learning from those experiences. Then there will be a guided exercise that you can participate in, and you'll need either paper and a pen or an open digital document to participate with that exercise. And then finally, we'll look at how to move forward with human rights-centered design in our work. So, to tell you a little bit more about myself, my name is Eriol. My pronouns are they, them. I've been working in digital product design and user experience for around 10 years. I've spent 7 years of that time doing humanitarian or third sector work or charity NGO work. And I've been working on and contributing to open source software for 3 years, which isn't really that long a time, but it's been an in-depth 3 years. I'm also now working towards a PhD with research that explores the relationship between designers and humanitarian or for good open source software projects, and how these designers participate in these open source software projects. I call myself a human rights-centered designer. So, I'm a human rights-centered designer. What does that actually mean? You may have heard of the term human-centered designer, where the designers of tools and software and experiences aim to center the human in their work. This doesn't mean that the technology goals or business goals are ignored, but rather centers these humans, these people, in what they use and what they need, and ensures that the right choices are being made for them as the primary reason that that technology is created and remains useful. Because after all, the people that use these technologies, these tools that we make, are the forward momentum defining what is created, and that creation must be useful and valid for them. Human rights-centered design differs in a way where we not only consider the needs of people that will use and experience what we create, but their known and unknown human rights within these interactions with technology. A reasonably quick example of this could be around privacy. Say you've created a tool that has a feature where people can have location enabled and stored within that tool. Most people, we assume, know their own needs around location well enough and are competent enough with tools generally, that if we make options for the security of that location data accessible, that the people that use it will choose the privacy configuration that works for them. This example already makes a lot of assumptions. Primarily, that the people know what the risks are to their safety more widely. In the same example, consider someone whose identity is criminalized somewhere. We could look to the LGBT+ communities here, and we could begin to think about what they might need to protect their rights and safety that are not part of our simple assumed story. I began to think more in this way during my time at an organization called Ushahidi. So Ushahidi is a Kenyan NGO that makes humanitarian open source software technology for human rights. They were founded in 2008 in the aftermath of election turmoil in Kenya. Ushahidi's mission and subject matter expertise is in building varied kinds of communication technology to empower people to raise their voices while delivering tools to help organizations listen better and respond to those people that are raising their voices. Ushahidi platform is most commonly used for things like disaster response, election monitoring, and human rights abuse reporting. To describe what's visible on the screen right now is a screenshot of QuakeMap, showing a report from a citizen of a hospital being destroyed during the Nepal earthquakes, and a small graphic showing that 700 plus medical response helicopters were deployed by the Nepalese army from this open source collected citizen information. There is also an example of Ushahidi's emergency communication tool 10.4, which was created after the Westgate Mall terrorist attacks in Nairobi, in order to aggregate communications in crisis situations better. While at Ushahidi as a designer, I worked across lots of different projects, building and improving the open source software technology for cases like how to improve access to healthcare and reduce HIV and AIDS infections in adolescent girls and young women, build resilience through mutual aid and community support in crisis and disasters, and improve peace building and education across communities in East Africa. I now do design at the Open Food Network, where I work on their open source technology to enable new ethical supply chains where communities can bring together producers to create a virtual farmers market, building resilient local food economies. Access to food is a human right, and the process to make food more open, sustainable, and part of the commons is a goal I strongly adhere to. The Open Food Network doesn't just maintain and support an open source software platform that allows producers to globally sell their produce and people to buy from them, but it enables and nourishes a global community focused on learning, understanding, and improving how we as humans consume and care for the planet through produce. Before I started to join my work in design and human rights, I was involved in and led a number of community development projects locally. These were things like homework clubs for kids to support parents who had newly emigrated into the UK. I established and cared for community gardens that helped those recovering from substance abuse issues, and provided growing space for those in a city area that had really limited green space, where the surplus produce was actually given to a community learning kitchen for refugees upskilling themselves in their new home environments. I also helped support women seeking asylum groups to meet and share their stories, and regenerated alleyways through arts projects and led community mapping projects that celebrated the local community ecosystems. More recently, I've been involved with React UK, formerly Team Rubicon UK, with domestic, so UK-based, disaster response and prevention, including serving for the first wave of their Operation React COVID-19 response here in the UK within their tech and coordination department in the voluntary HQ, looking after all the databases of all the different needs coming in across the UK around the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm actually just signed up to help with the local vaccination centre here where I am based locally in the southwest of the UK over the next coming weeks. Other organisations I'm involved with include the search and rescue organisation SARAID, Community Resilience Team, on other domestic operations supporting the homeless populations in wintertime, and doing river watch sweeps late at night when accidental falls are at their highest. And the Marmalade Trust, who help with loneliness in older people, especially those who have no remaining family during holiday times and crisis times. Lastly, to bring in the connection to my open source and design work, I am a chapter leader at London's Open IDEO group, where we work on supporting the wider UK design community in responding to Open IDEO's humanitarian challenges. And with projects like FOSS Responders, a community of open source folks that supported FOSS projects in the early days of COVID-19 to access emergency support funds and other kinds of support to remain resilient as COVID-19 continued to affect the FOSS communities. With the efforts that I've made to centre human rights in my professional and personal life, you might think that it's easy to integrate an advocate. It's not. It's really difficult due to multiple different factors. But the pressure of design and technology to sideline human rights as a focus is one of the hardest parts. This snippet from a conversation between myself and Kat Lowe, who is content moderation lead and UX lead at Medan and fellow Human Rights Centre designer. We were speaking about how we both struggle to not prioritise human rights in our work. The snippet reads, "After designing for some of the most extreme human rights circumstances, it became extremely difficult, if not impossible, to not centre human rights in our design approach." But I didn't start out being human rights centred. I did a lot of different community work personally, and professionally, I was working on many different kinds of design projects before I entered the human rights tech world. But I was still, until recently, compartmentalizing and not centering human rights in my work. But I do remember strongly the first big nudge towards centering human rights in my work. So it was 2017, and I was working as a designer shortly before joining Ushahidi in a tech for parents startup. They made a useful product and had a really good mission to help parents and kids better talk about the time spent on devices and curb so-called screen addiction. I had asked during my interview and wondered in my first few weeks whether the young people being monitored and limited through their devices always truly consented, and how that power was exercised by a parent. I asked, has there ever been a case of abuse where a parent has stopped a kid seeking information that they should have rights to? When I asked this to my soon-to-be colleagues, I was thinking about myself as a younger teen, which was before the internet was thoroughly used by my parents' generations. And I was finding information about LGBT+ issues and discovering an identity that was mine to internally explore. And I wondered, would I have been stopped from viewing that? What would I have been stopped from viewing? And how would the act of being monitored as a young person affect my relationship with the people that were caring for me? I was assured that there were policies and considerations being taken, and I was placated. Then a customer support request came through. a friend of a woman who was asking how to remove the app from somebody's device because their friend's partner was using this application that we had created to track and control their device and communication. The partner was being controlled through this technology. The team was asked, what should we do? How should we respond? What was our responsibility here? There was a quiet kind of panic, one that happens when something you'd hoped to never face arises. These kinds of problems are the ones that keep me awake at night thinking, what if? What if somebody uses our technology in this way and it harms someone? We talked as a team. How do we address this? Some were more involved than others, citing company policy of only she, the abused partner, can request the removal of the software with his, the abuser partner's, consent. So the friend asking on the abused woman's behalf was not in a great place to support her friend that was really in a tough situation. Can we delete the accounts? Can we block them? Lots of ideas on how to solve this problem. I spoke up. As a person who had experience of partner abuse, and I said, doing any action to rouse suspicion for the abuser could really put this woman in more danger, and we can't know what might happen if we suddenly remove this tool of control. We need to support the friend and the woman to get to a safe situation before doing anything that could result in violence. I worked with the customer support rep to find the closest charity organization to that individual that was being harmed that could ensure their safety before any technology solutions could be attempted. Was this enough? We'll never be sure. And while I attempted to have further conversations afterwards about safeguarding others, the issue was largely put to the side as an anomaly or an edge case. So, everyone, I would like to ask, have you had a similar experience? Was there a moment that made you pause with concern? There should be a poll question that appears on your screen where you can answer if you wish. I won't be able to see these until the end of our time here, but we can revisit the answers then. I'll pause for a few seconds for you to read the question, consider, and respond should you wish. Okay. So I'd like to move into expressing why I believe open source is uniquely able to support human rights-centered design work now. As a participant in open source software from a design perspective for a few years now, I've seen open source software offer the opportunity for designers to contribute in ways that can center and prioritize human rights regardless of the specific function and nature of the open source software technology or tool. Tools like Drupal, by way of involving the design community and allowing for a human rights approach, can really pioneer this approach, which is often avoided and often pushed to the sides as these edge cases. But first, to briefly understand why designers care about open source. To some of you, it may be fairly new to hear of designers' interest in contributing to open source software. So designers see how they can learn, how they can grow, collaborate, and communicate. And I asked members of the open source design community to comment on this, so you can hear not only from myself, but directly from them through some recorded videos. So here's a video coming up from Franklin, who is new to open source. Let's hear what they have to say.
I think designers should participate in open source software because they'll have the opportunity to learn and collaborate with other designers, and also this helps to improve one's communication skills. It's also a way to get feedback, suggestions, and constructive criticism from other participants and designers. And this helps to improve one's skills and also market someone's personal brand.
I've also next got a video from Florian, who is a designer, again, new to open source software, who is part of the mutual aid open source software design team.
Why is it important for designers to be part of open source software? I think that this paradigm that open source software is not as good or not as serious as non-open source software is, this paradigm has shifted. It's over, actually. Open source software is part of our everyday lives, and so it definitely deserves the same treatment that non-open source software gets. And one of these things, one of these treatments is a proper design process. So a user-centered design process. And that's actually what I think, for me at least, open source software is. It's something for the people. And with that in mind, I think design is also, today, design is user-centered. It should be, at least. And therefore, these two things really go well together, and they enhance each other. So I don't think that a proper designed software is only meant for non-open source software. I think designers should be as much involved in open source software as in non-open source software.
I love hearing from my design community talk about open source software. It always gives me great joy. So as designers become more involved in open source software, they begin to see and expand their use of human-centered approaches. And I see human rights open source projects being sought out by designers, or human rights being considered in their approaches. In these projects, designers can really express the importance of these harmful edge cases and use the more commonly used term of stress cases now. Here's another video from Courtney, who has been around open source software for a little while and who is also part of the mutual aid open source design team.
Empathy is a core tenet of design. As a designer, when I work to center our users' humanity, I do so with the thought that empathy isn't just about understanding how a user feels when they interact with something we build. It's being cognizant that we are all the sum of our experiences, our background, our culture, our status, our privilege, our environment. All of this and more impacts how we view and interact with the world and tools around us. I will never fully comprehend what others experience. In human-centered design, my role as a designer isn't just to be empathetic. It's also to elevate and amplify the voices of others so that no one is left out of the conversation and no one is left behind. Thank you.
So we've heard about why designers start in open source software and how involvement in open source software projects can allow for a human rights-centered approach after some time. But let's clarify why designers care about human rights in tech. Because our human rights are intrinsically interwoven in how we form technology. Designers can be privileged to be at the beginning of how technology and tools protect our rights by weaving safety and care into what we design. And in fact, they can be part of the process not only in the beginning, but throughout the software journey. I've got a video here now from Jackie, who is embarking on a human rights-centered design journey after having come from an NGO background, and expresses beautifully why many designers feel it's of utmost importance to center human rights in our work.
I further human rights as a designer by using an intersectional lens in everything I do and actively engaging in advocacy in other areas. Everything we do and don't do has an impact on people, and if we're not intentionally working against injustice, then we are unintentionally complicit in it. Centering human rights is very important because, to me, the purpose of design and tech is to advance the human race. Design and tech are commonly known to be human-centered, but those of us in these industries cannot claim this if we're focused on instantaneous results, self-gratification, and profit at the expense of people's well-being. These are not separate entities. They are interconnected. In order to evolve as a human race, we need to strive to be inclusive and serve the needs of all humans, not just any one person or a specific group of people. We must be active and intentional in every aspect. The design and tech industries have the ability to truly innovate and bring positive change for human rights, so we must center this in our work.
I cannot agree more, Jackie. So let's return to that conversation with Kat Lowe about finding it difficult to remove human rights from our thinking and ask ourselves, why should I? Though the problems in tech are minimized through edge cases, we can remind ourselves to center humans and their rights and their safety in our work. So folks, take some time to consider the next question, the next poll question. How often have you heard a similar phrase to, this tech works for most people, even if it doesn't work for the few? Or have you heard the notorious edge cases be mentioned in your conversations? These questions are quite cerebral, they're quite deep, so I take a little bit of time for you to consider the question and the answers. And if you like to add more context into the chat windows, we can get to those later on in the Q&A section of this talk. So, I want to address the definition of open source software in a humanitarian and for good context, because this can get fuzzy. The amount of open source software projects that have human rights focuses is growing, and access to these help with design contributions as a great opportunity. However, I do believe that by the virtue of being open, many open source projects, not directly human rights focused, are still doing for good work. And I consider most open source software as work towards human rights or for good purposes. I'm aware that there are likely projects actively working against these for good aims, and perhaps even individuals. But they are still open source, and this is why I say most and not all open source projects work towards for good and human rights. I'd like to tell two more stories from open source software projects where I've been able to slowly introduce human rights centered design in the work. So, back in 2018, I was attending a team sprint where we traveled to a location to work on our open source software project's feature roadmap and plans for the coming year. I was reasonably new to the team, and we had a good relationship with good foundations of respect and openness and communication. However, like many tech teams, we often got excited and carried away when discussing features and improvements to our technology. We were working on a crisis communication app where people can send and receive messages in dire situations like terrorist attacks, natural disasters, and similar events. We were gathered round a table, and I was stood off to the side. In these kinds of groups, I tend to be a bit quieter, contemplative, and I listen and absorb the information that is being exchanged amongst my peers. The particular feature we were talking about was being referred to as a panic button. The idea made sense, a way for people in these dire and dangerous situations to more easily send messages to contacts. But when we started to draw and sketch these ideas, we started to envisage this large red button filling a phone screen that said panic. The team were excitedly talking about how it could function, and the user would just tap this big red panic button and a message would be sent here, and the configuration of it can operate in this way or this way. And then a thought occurred to me suddenly. What kind of person would hate to see me push that big red button filling that screen? What if I was in a hostage situation and needed to be more subtle? That reminded me of how people who are in situations of control might need to send subtle, careful messages to stay safe. How can this still help the person who it needs to help, but also be discreet in certain situations? What if this could actually hurt someone than help them? I gently stopped the energetic conversation and I explained the case of someone that might need to be more discreet with their panic button needs, and that a panic button isn't inherently a bad idea, but executed poorly could harm as much as it helped. Could we then consider this under multiple circumstances and how we might make sure that those that need subtlety are cared for? I used the two examples that came to mind, a hostage situation and a domestic violence situation. One of these I had more experience with than the other, though I knew what it was like in some ways to be held in a single space through threat of violence and be closely monitored as I use different tools and different technology. The team, after I described these stories, were quiet for several seconds. The excited energy calmed, felt uneasy for a moment, until the team took the time to process the examples and begin to consider this approach, and we were guided back into a space that allowed for excitement, but with an added care for the complexities of the humans we were building for and all the aspects that might be unknown to us about their safety. As humans with broad and varied experiences, we often have access to insight and information ourselves that can help us pause and consider our approaches. So, audience, our next poll question: have you given or received information about a difficult subject? Take some time to think about how that situation played out after you answer the poll. On to our second story. Often designers are asked to work with those that use the tools that we create. Through research and participatory approaches, we learn and experience what our users, the humans that use our tools, go through in order to better represent and advocate for their needs. Though often these processes touch upon deeply personal topics. I was working on a project with a large and varied team around the role of technology in peace building and peace education. The goal was to better understand and build tools that helped those advocating for peace in societies and communities that faced violence and crisis. In the research part of this project, we were asked to do a number of different design activities, one of which was called journey mapping. This is where, with your users, you map the events, actions, thoughts, and feelings of an event or a time period. You may have seen or participated in these before. The main difference here was we needed to understand as a team what happened during a violent incident to better prepare technology tools for those incidents. The idea of journey mapping, what was essentially people's trauma, didn't sit well with me at first, and I had not come across many methods or processes to properly care for those people whose experiences could really still be harming them. But I knew that the typical method would not be sufficient. Also, there weren't many methods that considered the health and safety of the researchers or the people involved in the interactions with the people that were doing the mapping of their own events. I spent a lot of time with my two closest amazing workmates on a way of meeting the needs of the project while introducing care and ethics into this exercise. I used my own understanding of traumatic experiences to consider an adapted approach. At this point, I'd like to introduce you to Polycom Women. Polycom Women are a group of women across many generations and backgrounds dedicated to peace building in Kibera, which is an informal settlement, or more commonly phrased as a slum, in Nairobi in Kenya. They undertake a number of different peace building activities in their area, including peaceful protest, skills growth, and speaking to and engaging with youth on multiple different difficult topics. Working with Polycom and the other attendees at these workshops about peace was one of the first times I was confronted with my own experience of trauma, as well as other people's, and how to really manage that in a design research context for technology. We met Polycom Women before our workshop journey mapping exercise, and I remember how casually these women spoke of being harmed as they peacefully protested and attempted to continue their peace building work. It was at this point that I knew that building tools and processes for people that have been and are traumatized means better understanding your own perspective on trauma and experiences of trauma. Before our activities, I went through the same exercises I would be asking people to do for us. And I asked them to detail their experiences. Before I asked them to detail their experiences, I first shared mine with them. Here's an example from a workshop participant of their journey map. It's separated into before the incident, during the incident, and after the incident. On close-up, you can see elements from the participants showing events like war and tribal conflict, high food prices, and sound of bullets. Though my own incident journey map around my own experience of trauma had a very different context, the sentiment was similar, if not the same. Sharing of experiences that may have shaped a part of you in order to better understand how we might improve. Each of the team involved in the exercise was asked to do this exercise themselves, but there was no obligation to have these used as examples. This allowed us as a research group to better understand and connect with these people, the people that we were going to be making tech for and going to be improving tech for. There were many ways that we ensured what we did was as ethical as possible. So, as mentioned, the researchers went through the same process. The researchers' examples were used in the workshop for compassion building. The attendees were notified pre the workshop of the subject matter, so they had the choice to not attend if they didn't feel ready to. There was psychological support on site, both for the attendees and the facilitators and researchers. There was confidentiality, and the researchers were supported after the workshop as well as during. So, to ask the audience our next question, after these two stories, I would like to ask, do you think your organization or projects that you contribute to could benefit from talking with those that are most harmed by what you create? Another poll should be popping up on your screen around about now. And at this point, as you consider your answer for this question, I'd like to say that the Polycom women and other people doing peace activities weren't using specific peace advocacy only technology. They were using Facebook, Twitter, SMS, pen, paper, computers, websites, CMS, and many tools of many different kinds. So we're going to move into a guided journey mapping activity. Journey maps are powerful activities that you can keep for your own use, or if you feel happy to and ready to, you can share it with those that you work alongside, or you could even make them open. I'm going to ask you to think of a deeply upsetting event in your life, and like with the previous stories participants, we'll begin to journey map this event. Doing this activity is optional and not advised if you are still affected by the event that you're thinking of mapping and would need some recovery after revisiting this subject matter. Instead, you can listen to my examples and follow along. If you're creating a journey map about an event that, if discovered by someone else, could result in your own harm, I recommend either destroying the journey map shortly after completing it or abstaining from this exercise. For those listening and not participating, there will be a few pauses of silence while I offer time for those participating to write and reflect and work with their own material. There'll be about 5 seconds after each statement so that those people following along and doing their own exercise have time to write and think. So this is where you'll need some paper and a pen or an open digital document. At the top of your page, you can write a brief sentence or a keyword about what you are mapping. My example will be PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder flashback while using Google Sheets during an online meeting. But you can choose to describe your own upsetting event in your own way. There is no competition here for what is mapped. you choose what you want to map and explore. There is no hierarchy in your own experience of upsetting events and with others. Separating this page into 3 sections, add the title of the first section as the before, the center as during, and the last as after. So you'll need to have, after you've described the title of the upsetting event, you'll need these 3 sections: before, during, and after. Before can be a time period of your choice. I recommend no longer than a few days before the event or the during part of the incident. Hours and minutes are also good to explore. The during section are the actions and events that happened as the upsetting event is happening. You choose the time boundary of the during phase. Again, the upsetting event could take minutes, it could take hours, or it could be over a number of days. The after section is like the before section, where you describe what is happening after the upsetting event. Like the before section, this can be in days, hours, or minutes. What I'll be asking you to do is try to write short statements, sentences, or words that describe what you were doing, what you were thinking, and what you were feeling. An example might be, I was calmly shopping out with friends in the mall, or I was thinking about a worrying post on my friend's social media that morning, or I was feeling tense and stressed. In my example, I use color codes and words to assign the attributes of doing, thinking, feeling, and also when tech was used. You can write symbols, you can use color codes, or you can use the words to categorize and add attributes to your own statements. As we map these upsetting events, it is interesting to notice when we have used technology as part of this event and whether we've used technology at all. Here, what we do is to begin to weave the thread between our very human experiences and the technology we use, and sometimes the technology that we build. Finally, before I head into my example, the purpose of this guided exercise isn't to finish a perfect journey map. It's to explore a personal experience should you choose. So, the title of my journey map, for those following along to listen and not necessarily writing your own, is a PTSD flashback while using Google Sheets during an online meeting. The first statement is a doing statement, which is before I was preparing for a meeting. The next statement, which I've attributed to thinking and feeling, is I was overwhelmed with work. The next statement, which I've attributed to thinking and feeling, is nervous. The next statement is that I was feeling and thinking about being unsure and feeling unsteady. Moving into the during section now of my own journey map, the first statement is that I was trying to follow conversations happening in the meeting, and I've attributed thinking to this statement. The next statement is that I felt about 5 seconds of delay in the speech that I was hearing. And I've attributed the feeling statement attribute to this. The next statement is that I was breathing fast or fast breathing, and I've attributed doing and feeling to this. The next statement is that I was hyper aware of my surroundings, and I've attributed feeling to this. The next statement is that I turned off my camera and I stopped speaking. I've attributed doing to this. The next statement is I was struggling to read the cells in the spreadsheet that we were using in the meeting, and I've attributed doing to this statement. The next statement is that I was using very short sentences when I was required to reply to people. I've attributed doing and thinking to this. The next statement is that I was holding my breath when I was called upon to respond, and I've attributed doing to this statement. The next is that I was experiencing blurred vision, and I've attributed doing and feeling to this. Moving into the after section of my own journey map, the first statement is that I was feeling panicked, and I've attributed feeling and doing to this statement. The next statement is that I was having visions and seeing physical memories of injuries. I've attributed doing and thinking to this statement. The next statement is that my limbs were going rigid or very stiff, and I've attributed doing and feeling to this statement. The next is that I was beginning to scream and cry. I've attributed feeling to this statement. The next is that I had turned off my computer. I attribute doing to this statement. And the last one on this journey map is the statement of exhausted, and I've attributed feeling to this statement. I'm going to go back over the statements that I've attributed to tech being used in this example. In this example journey map, I've added the label of when tech was used to the statement in the before section, which was preparing for a meeting. I've attributed the label tech used in the during phase to trying to follow conversations, feeling 5 seconds delay in speech, and holding my breath when called on, and blurred vision, and turning off my camera and stopping speaking. In the after section, I've attributed the statement of turning off the computer to tech used. Now, these attributes could actually be added to other statements. Some of these statements might feel like more feeling or doing or thinking phrases. Again, the purpose of this exercise isn't necessarily to get these explicitly accurately labeled, but to better explore and better define what was happening during this event. I'm going to move into a second example now to give the people that are following along with this exercise a little bit more time and to give you a variation on another kind of event. This example is an experience that I had when helping with a missing person report for a parent. So the first statement in the before section is I was working a regular day at my desk in the office. I've attributed doing and tech used to this statement. The next is that I received a phone call and I missed it because of my work hours. I've attributed doing and tech used to this statement. I was checking messages on my break. This has the doing and tech used label. I received a crisis message from my family. This has the doing and tech used label. I called my family, panicked. How can I help? This has the doing and tech used label. And I left work quickly, notifying my boss and drove home. This has the doing label. Moving into the during phase of this journey map, I was worrying. I had long waits comparatively to what else was happening. And I've attributed doing and feeling to this statement. I was having lots of long phone calls, and I've attributed doing and tech used to this statement. I was doing radio appeals for the missing person, and I've attributed doing and tech used to the statement. I was pacing, restless, and felt like I had nothing useful to do. I've attributed doing, thinking, and feeling to this statement. I returned to work, but I was distracted. And I've attributed doing, feeling, and tech used to this statement. I had lots of questions, frustration in the lack of answers, and I attribute doing and feeling to this statement. I had many interviews with police and other organisations, and I've attributed doing and tech used to this statement. There were accusations, house searches, and I was scared. I've attributed doing and feeling to this statement. I was retracing a lot of details about the missing person. I've attributed doing and thinking to this statement. In the after section, I was checking police articles at least once per day. And I've attributed tech used to this statement. I was calling the police service number at least once per day as well, until 3 times as the maximum. And I've attributed doing and tech used to this statement. I was checking Facebook posts in the local area, and I've attributed tech used to this statement. And after my mother was found, I took time thanking people, and I attribute doing, feeling, and tech used to this statement. Afterwards, I was feeling relaxed but confused. I've attributed feeling to this statement. And I was unsure how to proceed, and I had many questions still. and I attribute feeling and thinking to this statement. These journey maps and a blank template will be available to you to use if you want to after this talk, including my examples here. So I want us to take just a few seconds to breathe and come back from that exercise. Even if you weren't participating with mapping your own, even listening to somebody else's journey map of these kinds of events can affect you. So let's take 10 seconds to breathe and relax. So at this point, I'd like to ask you all, could you see this exercise being useful for the projects that you are involved in? You can elaborate on this answer in the chat if you choose, but if you don't want to give extra details about the kinds of experiences and the kinds of details, please don't feel like you have to. I'm mostly curious as to whether you think that this could be useful for what you're working on and what you're involved in. So we've been through one exercise that could be useful in centering human rights in our design, open source, and technology work. But there are so many more. There are 2 other activities I've learned from amazing people in the human rights-centered design community and the Tech for Good community that I really want to briefly share with you all. So the first is called Persona Non Grata by Molly Wilson of Simply Secure. And the second is a red team versus blue team exercise by Johnny Ray Evans of Snook. You may have heard of red and blue teaming in other technology contexts, but this is in a design and tech and human rights centered design context. To show you what the persona non grata exercise looks like and to briefly explain, these are the 10 persona non grata. These are people you probably don't want in your product or your service, but who are likely to find their way in anyway. The idea of the persona non grata exercise is to explore how or what these personas could be doing with your tools and open source to better mitigate the potential problems that can arise. An example of some of these personas are the stalker, the abuser, the fraudster, and the terrorist. Explanations of all of these different personas and how to work with them in the exercise will be available in the link when you have access to the slides after the talk. The blue team versus red team exercise is about applying the ideas of penetration testing to your product discovery processes. This is your blue team. They are the product team who are going to do your discovery work, shape the idea, and try to validate it. Then you enter the red team. This is a similar team of experts to the blue team, and they know nothing about the product. The blue team pitch the idea. The red team listen, they take notes, and they ask questions for clarification. And then their job is to go to war with you, to try and find out why it won't work, how it might fail, and how it could hurt people. They are there to stop your social network, for example, being overrun with Nazis. I recommend either or all of these exercises and more to begin to explore how to center human rights in your design, open source software, and technology projects. So we started with what an interest in human rights can look like, how it can start, and how the challenges for designers and open source software impact those very designers. We shared stories of how this can be started to be worked with, the conversations that you could have, and then how it can be expanded and used in different parts of the technology process and the impact it can have. But we're at a crossroads now. Open source software can empower designers to explore human rights needs and topics through its openness and relevancy to those that need their human rights centered. Oh no. Sorry. If open source leads where commercial tech fears to tread, open source leads where commercial tech fears to tread. That's what happens when a small technical hitch can throw you in your talk. And if OSS leads, as it has done in many ways in the past, then this can be good for all whose rights are at risk. So, as we come to the end, I'd like to ask you all, what would nudge you into centering human rights in your work? Will it be people suffering with illnesses like COVID-19, unable to access information about infection risk? Will it be people who reach out on social media platforms to speak about institutional violence and cruelty? Will it be those that reach out to you when the tech that you've helped build has allowed for private files to be leaked? What about when someone is tracked, monitored, and judged for something that they cannot and should not change, like who they love and what they believe in or how they look? What if all or any of these were people that you know and love? And what if these happen to you? It's all well and good to say you believe in and support human rights. And it's great when folks take that outside their work and roles into protests and policy and advocacy and charity. But why not take it where we spend much of our lives, our workplaces and tech communities where we make useful tools? You might think of the risks, the worry, the concern for your own stability and peace. But when there is so much at stake for everyone, the steps you make to being more human rights focused, the more the risks will become normalized and will begin to make human rights centered in our tools. I'd like to wrap up with lots of resources and links to guides. So if you're looking for small steps to become engaged with human rights, then I recommend reading reports from NGOs. Here's some to get started on screen right now. There's the Leaving No One Behind, Lessons from the Kerala Disasters. Safe Sisters, a digital security challenges document about from women who are human rights defenders. So these are their stories. And the Human Rights Big Data and Technology Project publications. I'm a huge reader and I love books, and these are just some books that I recommend you pick up or look at picking up and reading. So we've got Designing When Everyone Designs by Ezio Manzini, Digital Economies at Global Margins by Mark Graham, Digital Witness by Deberly, Koenig and Murray, Digital Democracy, Analog Politics by Nanjala Nyabola, Civic Technologist Practice Guide by Sid Harrell. These are all fantastic books. Further resources and tools for you to look into are organizations that produce open source technology or toolkits, guides, and video tutorials for human rights workers, technologists, and designers. On the screen right now, we have the Electronic Frontier Foundation at EFF.org, Access Now at accessnow.org, the Advocacy Assembly at advocacyassembly.org, Code for America Qualitative Research Guide, which you'll be able to access when you receive these slides, the Axis Tools Usable Guidebook at usable.tools/guidebook, and the Design Justice Network at designjustice.org. And finally, please consider following our Human Rights Centered Design Group, where we meet and discuss our work as designers, working for and with human rights, and support the ongoing conversations about human rights in tech, design, and open source. Thank you very much for listening to me, to Good Health Discussion, and here's where you can find me on the internet.
Okay, that was great. Thank you, Eriol. Actually, it's great to finally put, well, not finally, but to put design on a place where we hold responsibility also on the products or the projects we're in. And that's important to know that whatever we do can actually have impact. So I would like to start with the results of the polls. Let me read first the first of them. It was the first one that we listened. It was we listened that after the example about the app that was being used to track a partner. And actually, the question of the poll was, have you had a similar experience? Was there a moment that made you pause with concern? And actually, I would say 90%, 19% of the people is saying yes, that they have had a similar experience and they spoke up. And then there's 10% that said yes, and that they they said yes and that they could not speak up, and another 10% that said yes and they could not speak. They said no and they could not speak up. But the important one here, I think, there's a 35% of people that they are not sure about being on a situation like that. What do you think about that?
I think, well, that's understandable. I think that sometimes with this kind of content, with these kinds of stories, if they are the kinds of stories that have not been part of your life personally, sometimes they are harder to notice. Sometimes they are actively, I want to say, hidden from people that work on technology. I think one of the interesting things about that particular first story is that organization was a very small startup organization where we were all very involved in each part of the technology process. So actually, we all had a really great relationship with the customer support team. And I think that it's a testament to how a really good aspect of that particular organization and example is that the customer support person felt able to open the discussion, not only perhaps with their line manager, but other people that could help out. So I think that individual actually knew in a way that this is a really serious topic. It might be something, or it should be something that is spoken with the wider team. So designers, content creators, developers, and the person that actually manages them as a customer support representative, to be able to better, I guess, open source the information of how to open source collectively gather information about how to deal with this this case. But it doesn't surprise me that perhaps there have been things that people have heard happen, but they actually haven't been given all the information. So the not sure doesn't surprise me. But what I hope from those kinds of stories and telling these kinds of stories about technology, and I'm not the only one that tells these kinds of stories, that there's lots of people, fantastic speakers out there telling stories about how technology has harmed people or has been close to harming people, and all the different variations in between. But what I do hope to do with those kinds of stories is, open people's eyes to noticing them when they may happen, or at the very least, if you're not seeing them, if you're not exposed to those kinds of things happening in your organizations, that there might be a moment that you can take to yourself and think, what if somebody, like the persona non grata exercise that Molly created, you can start to think about the kinds of people that might want to do bad things with the things that you create, and start to explore the potential of those stories before actually being faced with them.
Nice. It is important. So about the second question, how often have you heard similar phrase to this tech works for most people, even if it doesn't work for the few or the edge cases? Actually, 18% of the people has said that yes, and frequently in project discussions, but almost a 50%, 48% has said yes a few times in project discussions. So putting them together, it's almost a 60%. So that is in a lot of situations.
Yeah, so this one was a very indulgent question from my perspective, but hey, it's a talk that I wrote, so you'll forgive me a very indulgent one. I hope. So edge cases isn't a phrase which is uncommon. So I'm not necessarily surprised that there are people that still hear that phrase being used. And I think that it's also a phrase that's used in lots of different contexts. But the context that I want people to particularly be aware of and consider is when the phrase edge case is used to distract teams from having conversations about difficult topics. So using edge cases to describe a non-typical tech setup might be completely relevant and valid to use it in that context. But like I said, when you have a sort of, an idea that the word edge case might be being used to say, oh, well, those people aren't, the most people that use our technology. I want you to consider, but should they be the people that we pay close attention to because they have unique needs, or they have a particular stress put upon them in their life, or are they in any kind of danger? And that's why they aren't like the majority of your users, say. So edge cases is also a term that is slowly being phased out in lots of different languages. In fact, there is a phrase which I believe I used in the talk called stress cases, which, again, changing the words doesn't necessarily mean that the phrase won't also be used to try and divert you from difficult conversations within these technology spaces. But it does change the context slightly when you use the word stress cases instead of edge cases, because edge, means off to the side, it's over there, we're not looking at that. Whereas stress cases does describe, okay, this person has extra stresses, or these users have extra stresses. And it was actually, I believe it was first used by, I really struggle to pronounce her last name, but Sarah Watcher, who wrote an incredible book called Technically Wrong, which is one of my absolute favorite books about how tech can go wrong and how tech can be used in really harmful ways. It's another book recommendation that I couldn't fit on my book recommendation slide. Otherwise, I'd probably have 50 slides of book recommendations.
Thank you. Well, the third poll, actually, to all attendees, remember that you have the live Q&A. I'm going to jump to the questions that you've posted in there, but if you have any other questions, please feel free to ask them in there. So on the third poll, it was asked, have you given or received any information about the difficult subject and think about how that situation played out? Actually, also around 60% of people said yes. Some gave information, and around the 40% said yes, and I listened for that. I would say that's good that only around 7% said no, but I could have given information. I would say that's good that there's not a huge percentage.
Yeah, I mean, that I think describes the work culture or the community culture that the people that feel comfortable talking, giving or receiving that information are in. And I think that necessarily the people that said that they couldn't isn't necessarily that they wouldn't, but they might not have been in the place where they could. So they might actually, I think one of the tricky things with this question, and one of the interesting things with this question is thinking about the people that don't feel safe and supported to offer the kinds of insight and information in a way that feels comfortable to them, that could really help the tools that you build move forward. What is happening there? You know, it's never an obligation for anybody to offer information about their personal experience, their personal life, what they've experienced in a work context, or in a community context. So it's never an obligation, but it does speak to how those cultures are cultivated, and how we encourage discussion of those things. I think the example that I used around the panic button, that story, I actually, when I told those examples, I was very careful with my language with the team. I used very third person language and hypotheticals. And as they became used to me talking about some difficult things, I then started to suggest that some of these things were things that I'd experienced as well. So I was kind of keeping myself safe whilst also offering information, but also testing how comfortable I was and also they were with this information. But yeah, it's not an obligation to do that.
I think I'm gonna jump into the live Q&A to the questions, because we have now we have several of them. Let's start with one that John Alvin asked. Do you see accessibility as an adjacent to or a part of human rights-centered design? Much of accessibility related to how the site is built, not to its design per se. When we make a site that is inaccessible, we are violating people's civil rights. Yeah,
absolutely. I think accessibility, there are lots and lots of different kinds of human rights and different things that are included within human rights. Like, I think one of the examples I gave early on is the right to food, the right to access information, and access information in the way that you are able to access information is absolutely a human right. And I think that there's lots of people that talk much more eloquently on how to build in accessibility than me. But I think that accessibility can be considered part of your human rights centered work. I could go for a long time about having human rights related conversations within your design practice within open source communities and working with technology is hard. And I think that that's what I was expressing within this talk. There are similar but very unique conversations that are also extremely difficult about prioritizing accessibility. My own personal experience of trying to push accessibility in design has multiple different aspects, from the aspect of what people view design to be as a sort of visual beautification of something versus how usable this is for many, many people. That's a conversation I've often had with designers as well. Like there are cohorts of designers which really do still struggle to make what they make in any way accessible, and they kind of sometimes will prioritize, what's the best way to describe it? Because I don't want to call it superficial, because making something beautiful can be is very, very often very needed. But anyway, yeah, so accessibility is definitely part of human rights work, and there are I think some specific things within the usable tools within the access tools that really look at that. I highly recommend having a look through that guidebook and looking at that.
Thank you. I was going to ask another question, another really interesting question, but we'll have to save that for the hallway. Yeah. So everybody, thank you for the questions. Thank you for participating on the polls. More than 100 people participated on each poll, so this is great. Yes, this is great. So you will find Eriol around the hallway, or she's going to be around. So if you really want to ask her some of the really interesting questions that were on the Q&A, please go and find her. She's going to be around for a while. And for the rest of you, have a nice DrupalCon.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Christina.